Little slave girl spots the forged pass. At dawn, the truth singer changes everything. A small girl with perfect pitch stands at the quarters fence while a handsome heir waits for her smile. She whispers that the wax seal curves backward, the patroller's papers are false. But when the overseer's ledger marks children by height and a night rider's wagon creaks toward the gate, her hymns prove to be more than lullabies. In a dust-sweet attic, stitched pages hide a dead woman's promise. Red wax gleams against old thread. The courthouse bell tolls as floodwaters rise and lanterns sway like desperate signals in the storm. When a child's voice cuts through the lies and her songs map the way to freedom, will the judge's gavel fall for mercy, or will the truth singer be silenced forever before she can save them all? Steam rose from Aunt Scylla's kettle as Elias Boone pressed his shoulder against the quarters fence. Dawn crept through the cypress like spilled honey. He held 2 biscuits wrapped in a clean cloth, same as yesterday, same as the day before that. The kitchen hands whispered he could have any debutante from here to Charleston, Miss Prescott with her ivory fan, Miss Hartwell with her French perfume, yet here he stood in the damp, waiting for a child's smile. Liddy appeared at the low doorway, her hair braided tight with a scrap of blue ribbon. She carried a broom handle worn smooth by small hands. Elias set the biscuits on the stoop post. She stepped closer, eyes downcast, then lifted her face just enough. The smile came slow as sunrise, careful, honest, bright as a struck match. "Morning, Miss Liddy," he said. She nodded once. Her fingers tapped the broom handle in perfect rhythm. The yard dogs, restless moments before, settled at her pattern. Even the guineas quieted their chatter. "That's a fine tune you're keeping," Elias said. Liddy's smile widened a hair. She touched a small locket at her throat, silver with a tarnished clasp. Inside would be a tiny portrait, though she'd never shown him whose face it held. The breakfast bell clanged from the big house. Feet shuffled in the quarters behind her. Aunt Scylla called from the kitchen window, "Boy, your coffee's getting cold as creek water." Elias straightened. "I'd best go see to ledgers and such." But he lingered another heartbeat. Liddy's smile held steady against the damp morning air, and something in his chest loosened like a knot coming undone. From the yard came the creak of leather boots. Overseer Rook unrolled a bound ledger, its pages thick with columns and figures. His shadow stretched long toward the quarters as he walked, pencil already in hand. Liddy's smile faded. She stepped back toward the doorway, broom handle clutched tight. The morning sweetness curdled like milk left in the sun. "I'll be back tomorrow," Elias promised. The words came out harder than he meant. She nodded again, but the light had gone out of her eyes. Rook set his ledger on the porch rail and called for the children. They came slow, some barely walking, others tall enough to reach his shoulder. He lined them against the doorframe, where years of notches marked their growing. "Inventory reduction," he muttered, scratching figures. "Debt service coming due." Liddy hummed 2 low notes, barely a whisper. Every dog in the yard lay down flat. The littlest children stopped their fidgeting. Even the mules by the water trough grew still. Elias stepped between Rook and the line of children. "What's this accounting?" "Estate business." Rook's pencil moved without pause. "Your daddy's debts don't pay themselves. I'll review the books with our lawyer. Lawyers in Charleston. Won't be back for a week." Rook's smile held no warmth. "Can't wait on lawyers when the collector's at the gate." He measured the smallest girl, barely 3, thumb in her mouth. Made a mark. Moved to the next. Liddy watched from the end of the line, her broom handle held like a walking stick. "One light girl," Rook wrote in the margin. His pencil pressed hard enough to tear the paper. Quick-tongued, the words hung in the morning air like smoke from a dying fire. Elias felt his hands curl into fists. "Children stay put until the lawyer returns," he said. Rook's laugh was dry as autumn leaves. "You don't give orders on this place yet, boy. Not till your daddy's cold in the ground and the debts are settled." That night, lantern light flickered through the quarters' windows. A wagon creaked up the lane after full dark 2 mules and a driver wrapped in a greatcoat. Behind him sat the night patroller, a man named Griggs with tobacco stains on his vest and a leather sap hanging from his belt. Elias met them at the yard gate. "State your business." Griggs unfolded a paper with a red wax seal. "Got a pass here to move some young stock. Private arrangement with your overseer." "Let me see that paper." The patroller held it up to the lantern light but didn't release it. The wax gleamed like a fresh wound. Latin words curved around the seal in careful script, but something felt wrong, like a familiar song played in the wrong key. From the shadows near the quarters, Liddy stepped into the light. She looked at the pass for just a moment, then whispered something to Elias that made his breath catch. "The motto's backward," she said, so quiet only he could hear. "And there's no wheat sprig on the seal." Elias studied the paper again. The Latin curved left where it should curve right. The state seal lacked its proper wheat symbol. His heart hammered against his ribs. "This pass is forged," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Griggs' face darkened. "You calling me a liar?" "I'm calling that paper false." The patroller's hand moved toward his sap, but the wagon driver cleared his throat. "Easy now," he said. "Plenty of other business down the road." Griggs folded the pass with sharp, angry creases. "This ain't finished." He climbed back onto the wagon. The driver clicked his tongue, and the mules lurched forward. Wheels squealed on the gravel as they rolled away into the darkness. Elias looked at Liddy. She clutched her locket with both hands, but her eyes held a strange light, not fear, but something closer to hope. "How did you know?" he asked. "My mama taught me letters before she got sent away. Said seals and signatures were like faces, you learn to know them true." Under the lantern's tilt, the memory of that false red wax lingered like the taste of something bitter. But Liddy's smile had returned, small as a candle flame but steady against the night. 3 days passed, without word from Griggs or his wagon. Rook stalked the plantation like a man with a fever, checking locks and counting heads twice each morning. The children stayed close to the quarters. Even the dogs seemed to sense trouble brewing. Sunday arrived grey and still. At the country chapel 5 miles downriver, preacher Josiah called for morning worship. Elias hitched the wagon and helped Aunt Scylla climb up, her best shawl wrapped around her shoulders. At the last moment, he turned to Liddy. "Come along," he said. "Might do you good to hear some proper hymns." She hesitated, then climbed into the wagon bed. The ride passed in silence except for the creak of boards and the slap of reins on leather. The chapel sat in a grove of live oaks, draped with Spanish moss, white-painted walls, cedar shingles dark with age. Inside, pine pews faced a simple altar where a patchwork quilt hung behind the pulpit squares of blue and brown and yellow, arranged in a pattern that seemed almost like a map. Preacher Josiah was a tall man with gentle hands and eyes the color of creek water. He opened his hymnal and announced the first song. "We'll sing 'Shall We Gather at the River,' verses 1 through 4. The congregation lifted their voices. But Liddy sang something different, the same melody, but different words, something about shallow bellies and 3 lanterns and 1 brown door. Josiah's voice faltered mid-verse. He stared at the child as if she'd spoken in tongues. His hymnal slipped from his fingers and hit the floor with a soft thud. The singing stopped. Every head turned toward Liddy. She looked up at the quilt behind the altar, then at the preacher, then at her folded hands. "Child," Josiah said carefully, "where did you learn those words?" "My mama sang them," Liddy whispered. "Said they were older than the church songs." The preacher's face went pale as birch bark. He glanced at the quilt, then at the faces in his congregation. Some looked puzzled. Others nodded as if they understood something Elias couldn't grasp. After service, Josiah pulled Elias aside. His hands shook as he spoke. "That child of yours, her mama's song maps the river route north. Ferry depths, lantern calls, safe doors kept by folks who don't ask questions." He swallowed hard. "It's a code we haven't heard sung aloud in 15 years. A code for what? For souls seeking freedom. Shallow bellies means the ford runs knee-deep. 3 lanterns is the signal at Tally's Crossing. 1 brown door belongs to the Quaker woman who runs the store in Millfield." Elias felt the world tilt beneath his feet. "You're saying—" "I'm saying that child's carrying directions to the underground road. Question is, how many other coded songs does she know, and who taught them to her?" The ride home passed in weighted silence. Liddy stared at the passing trees while Aunt Scylla dozed against the wagon side. Elias found himself looking at the girl differently, not just a child with a bright smile, but someone who held dangerous knowledge in her memory, like seeds hidden in her palm. Back at the plantation, he helped them down from the wagon. As Liddy walked toward the quarters, she began humming again, the same melody from church, but even softer now. The evening birds went quiet to listen. That night, alone in his father's study, Elias lit a lamp and pulled out maps of the county. His finger traced the river roads north, marking ferries and crossings. If Liddy's song was truly a coded route, then somewhere in these winding paths lay doors that opened for desperate souls. The question that kept him awake until dawn was simple. How many children would Rook sell before anyone else learned to sing those dangerous lullabies? Monday brought rain that drummed against the study windows like impatient fingers. Elias found Dr. Cates in his back room, grinding powders and mixing tonics for the autumn cough that plagued the quarters. "Brought my helper today," Elias said, ushering Liddy inside. "Thought she might learn something useful." Dr. Cates barely looked up from his mortar and pestle. "Keep her quiet." Got serious work here. The room smelled of camphor and willow bark. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, packed with bottles and jars labeled in Latin script. Liddy's eyes moved from bottle to bottle, her lips forming silent words as she read each label. A field hand named Moses lay on the examining table, skin hot with fever and lungs rattling like dry leaves. Dr. Cates poured a measure of dark liquid into a tin cup. 2 spoons every hour, he said. Should bring the fever down by morning. Liddy stepped closer to the bottle. Her finger traced the Latin words on the label. "Excuse me, doctor," she said quietly. "That bottle says quinque goutte 5 drops, but you poured near a whole spoonful." Dr. Cates stopped mid-motion. "What did you say?" "The bottle label. It says 5 drops, not 5 spoonfuls. For a fever this high, 5 spoonfuls might stop his heart." The doctor snatched the bottle and held it to the lamplight. His face went white as he read the Latin inscription again. He poured the tonic back into the bottle and measured out exactly 5 drops into fresh water. "How did you—" He stared at Liddy as if seeing her for the first time. "Child, can you read all these labels?" She nodded. "My mama taught me letters before the fever took her. Said knowledge was the one thing nobody could steal." "Doctor." Cates gave Moses the corrected dose, then turned to Elias with something like wonder in his eyes. This girl just saved that man's life. 5 spoonfuls of quinquina would have killed him sure as arsenic. Moses drank the medicine and settled back onto the table. His breathing came easier already. Liddy touched his forehead with the back of her hand, a gesture so natural and practiced it spoke of healing in her blood. "Well," Dr. Cates said after a long moment, "I believe I could use a helper who reads Latin." That evening, as lamplight flickered through the study windows, Elias climbed to the attic where old trunks held 3 generations of family papers. Dust swirled in the lantern light like tiny dancers. He pulled out his mother's Bible, leather-bound with a brass clasp, pages edged in gold. The binding felt loose in his hands. Curious, he examined the spine more closely. Near the back, fine stitches held a folded paper against the inside cover. His mother's sewing, he realized careful, deliberate work, hidden where only careful hands would find it. Footsteps creaked on the attic stairs. Liddy's head appeared through the trapdoor, her locket catching the lamplight. "Aunt Scylla sent me to call you for supper," she said. Then her eyes found the Bible in his hands. "That's beautiful work in the binding. You can see it from there?" She climbed the rest of the way up and knelt beside him. Her small fingers traced the stitched edge. "Someone sewed a paper inside. See how the thread's a different color, newer than the binding." Together, they worked the stitches loose. The hidden paper unfolded like a pressed flower, revealing his mother's careful handwriting in fading brown ink. At the top, an official seal pressed in red wax, the same seal that graced legal documents from the county clerk. "Manumission papers," Elias whispered, reading the formal language. "Mother freed several people in her will." Liddy leaned closer. There, that name smudged by wax drops, like someone was crying when they sealed it. The paper listed 5 names. 4 were clear, but the 5th had been blurred by what looked like teardrops that had fallen while the wax was still soft. Only the first letter showed plain an L, followed by shadows. "The locket," Liddy said suddenly. "There might be something in my locket." She fumbled with the clasp until it clicked open. Inside, where a portrait should be, lay only a tiny piece of folded paper. When she unfolded it, they saw a miniature painting a woman's face, kind eyes, the same blue ribbon in her hair that Liddy wore. But more important was what pressed against the back of the tiny portrait, an impression of red wax bearing the same seal as the manumission paper, the same color, the same design, the the same clerk's mark. Elias held the Bible page and the locket side by side. The wax impressions matched perfectly. "Your mother," he said, understanding flooding through him like cold water. "She was one of the 5 names." Liddy nodded, tears bright in her eyes. "She told me to keep the locket safe. Said someday it might be the key to a door I didn't know existed." Below them, Aunt Scylla called again for supper, but neither of them moved. In the dusty attic light, they had found something more precious than gold, proof that freedom had been promised, sealed, and hidden away until the right moment brought it back to light. The question now was whether anyone would honor a dead woman's will when living men had debts to pay. Tuesday morning brought Elias to the courthouse with hope in his chest and his mother's Bible under his arm. The county clerk, a thin man named Haviland with ink-stained fingers, looked up from his ledger books when Elias approached the high counter. "Mr. Boone, what brings you to town so early?" "Need to verify some manumission papers, sir, from my mother's estate." Haviland's eyebrows rose. He took the stitched page and examined it through a magnifying glass, paying special attention to the red wax seal. "This seal's genuine," he said after a long moment. "I remember your mother coming in must be 8 years ago now. She was particular about the wording." He looked up at Elias. "Course, manumissions have to be properly recorded to take effect. Can't just hide them away in family Bibles." "What would proper recording require?" "Testimony from witnesses who knew the deceased's intent. Proof the papers weren't forged. Payment of any outstanding debts against the named property." Haviland set the paper down carefully. "Takes a formal hearing before the probate judge." From across the courthouse square came the sound of boot heels on cobblestone. Through the window, Elias saw Rook walking toward the building, that leather ledger tucked under his arm like a weapon. "How long to arrange such a hearing?" Elias asked quickly. "Judge Whitmore's back from circuit court on Friday. We could hear it then, assuming proper notice gets posted." Haviland glanced toward the approaching footsteps. "Course, any debts against the estate would have to be settled first. Can't free property that's pledged to creditors." Rook pushed through the courthouse doors, his face dark with purpose. He nodded curtly to Elias and set his ledger on the counter with a heavy thump. "Morning, Clerk Haviland. Come to discuss some irregularities in the Boone estate accounting." Elias felt his stomach tighten. "What irregularities?" "Debts your father left unpaid. Loans against specific property." Rook opened the ledger and pointed to a column of figures. "This inventory's pledged as collateral. Can't be sold or transferred without the lender's consent." The clerk studied Rook's numbers through his magnifying glass. "Substantial amount. Who holds the paper on these debts?" "Griggs and Associates. They're prepared to collect immediately." A chill ran down Elias's spine. Griggs, the same night patroller who'd tried to pass off forged papers. Now he claimed to hold debt against the estate. "I'll need to see the original loan documents," Haviland said. "Can't take action on ledger entries alone." Rook's smile was thin as a blade. "Papers are being retrieved from Charleston. Should arrive by Friday." "Convenient timing," Elias said. "Just good business," Rook replied. "Now, about that hearing you were discussing might be premature until the debt situation gets resolved." Elias gathered up his mother's Bible and the stitched page. "We'll see about that on Friday." He left the courthouse with his hands shaking and his mind racing. 4 days to prepare for a hearing that would decide whether his mother's final wishes would be honored or buried under a pile of suspicious debts. 4 days to keep Liddy safe from men who saw her as nothing more than a line item in a ledger. That afternoon, he found Liddy in Dr. Kate's back room, grinding willow bark with steady, practiced motions. The doctor looked up from his prescription book when Elias entered. "Your help has been a blessing, Doctor," Kate said. "Caught 3 more dosage errors just this morning. Haven't had a single mistake since she started reading my labels." Liddy smiled, without looking up from her work. "It's like a puzzle. The Latin words tell you exactly what the medicine does if you know how to listen." "Speaking of listening," Elias said, "I've been thinking about those hymns, you know, the ones with the special verses." She paused in her grinding. "What about them? Could you teach them to someone else? If something happened to you, would those songs be lost?" Dr. Cates looked up from his book, suddenly attentive. Liddy set down her mortar and pestle. "Mama made me promise to only sing them when lives were at stake. She said the songs could save people, but they could also put folks in terrible danger. What if lives are at stake now? She studied his face for a long moment, then began to hum very softly. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, but the words she whispered were practical as a cookbook recipe. When the shallow belly runs, count the stones to 7. 3 lamps shine at crossing time, and the door is brown. That means the ford's knee-deep, when you can count 7 stepping stones. 3 lanterns at dusk means the ferry's safe to hail. The brown door belongs to someone who'll help without asking questions. Dr. Cates had stopped all pretense of working. His pen hung forgotten in his hand. "Child," he said carefully, "how many verses do you know?" 12 full songs. Each one maps a different road north. Mama said they were older than her mama's mama, passed down by women who knew what it meant to run. The weight of that knowledge settled over the room like dust after a windstorm. 12 routes to freedom, memorized by a girl who couldn't be more than 10 years old. "There's something else," Liddy said. "The songs have a tune for judging people. Like, when I hummed in church, I could tell the preacher was safe because he got scared in the right way. And when I saw that false pass, the paper felt wrong before I even read the words." "Felt wrong how?" "Like when someone tries to copy your mama's handwriting but doesn't know her heart. The letters might look right, but the spirit's all wrong." "Doctor?" Cates laid down his pen and came around the counter. He knelt beside Liddy's stool so they were eye to eye. "Little one, do you understand how important those songs are? There are people who'd kill to keep them from being sung, and others who'd die to learn them." "Yes, sir. That's why I've never sung them all the way through. Just bits and pieces when the Spirit moved me." She looked at Elias. "But if Friday's hearing goes wrong, there might not be another chance." That evening, they met at the country chapel as shadows grew long across the cemetery. Preacher Josiah had lit candles along the altar rail, their flames steady in the still air. Mrs. Tally, the Quaker woman from Millfield, sat in the front pew with her hands folded and her grey dress neat as a pin. "Dr. Cates sent word," Josiah said. "Says we need to hear what the child knows." Liddy stood before the patchwork quilt that hung behind the pulpit. In the candlelight, its pattern looked even more like a map: blue squares for water, brown for safe houses, yellow for roads that led to freedom. She began to sing. Not the coded verses this time, but a simple hymn about walking through the valley of the shadow of death. Her voice was sweet and clear, but underneath the familiar words, Elias could hear something else, a rhythm that matched the quilt's pattern, a melody that turned directions into music. When she finished, Mrs. Tally wiped her eyes with a plain handkerchief. "Child," she said in her soft Quaker accent, "thy mother was Mary Delacroix, was she not?" Liddy nodded. "I knew her well. She stopped at my store many times, always with that same locket around her neck. We spoke of many things: freedom, faith, the courage required to act on both." "Did she tell you about the songs?" "Not directly. But when folks came through my store seeking supplies for long journeys, Mary would hum these melodies. Those who knew how to listen understood what she was offering." "Preacher." Josiah leaned forward in his chair. "Mrs. Tally, are you saying this child's mother was part of—" "I'm saying Mary Delacroix was a woman who helped souls find their way to safety. The songs weren't just directions, they were a test. Only someone with pure intentions could hear them truly." Liddy fingered her locket. "Mama said the songs would know when they were needed. Said they'd sing themselves through me when the time was right." Outside, a dog barked in the distance. They all tensed, listening, but no other sounds followed. Just the wind in the oak trees and the soft pop of candle wax. "Friday's hearing will determine whether you stay free or get sold south," Elias said. "If things go poorly, the songs will be ready," Liddy said simply. "And so will I." Wednesday brought storm clouds that gathered like an army on the western horizon. The air grew thick and still, pressing down on the plantation like a held breath. In the quarters, children played quietly while their mothers watched the sky with worried eyes. Elias spent the morning going through his father's papers, searching for any documentation of the debts Rook claimed existed. He found bills of sale, crop receipts, and correspondence with factors in Charleston, but nothing that mentioned loans from Griggs and Associates. Around noon, the first fat raindrops began to fall. By evening, the storm had settled over the county like a brooding hen, sending sheets of water across the roads and turning creeks into torrents. At the midwife's cabin, where Liddy had been staying for her safety, lamplight flickered behind oiled paper windows. Inside, old Aunt Mercy tended her herb garden and sang softly while she worked. Liddy sat at the scrubbed pine table, learning to write her letters with a goose quill and pot of homemade ink. "Your hand's getting steady," Aunt Mercy said, watching Liddy form careful words on brown paper. "Won't be long before you're reading and writing like a schooled lady." "If I get the chance to learn," Liddy said, "child, you got to have faith. The Lord works in mysterious ways, but he always works." Thunder rolled across the plantation, rattling the cabin windows. In its echo, they heard the sound of horses on the muddy road, several riders moving fast despite the weather. Aunt Mercy blew out the lamp and peered through a crack in the shutters. 6 men on horseback. Griggs leading them, looks like. Liddy's hand tightened on her quill. "They coming here?" "Headed for the big house, near as I can tell. But we best stay quiet till they pass." The riders splashed through puddles and disappeared into the storm. After a few minutes, lamplight appeared in the windows of the main house. Voices carried on the wind, loud, angry, demanding. "They're looking for you," Aunt Mercy said. "Good thing you're not there." But Liddy had risen from her chair and moved to the window. She pressed her ear against the shutter, listening not just to voices but to something else, a rhythm in the storm, a pattern in the thunder. "The rain's telling a story," she said quietly. "What kind of story? About water rising? About roads washing out? About folks getting trapped who ought to be moving?" She turned from the window with her face pale but determined. "Aunt Mercy, I need to get to the chapel. Child, you can't go out in weather like this. The preacher needs to know about the storm, and Mrs. Tally needs to be warned. If the river rises much more, her store's going to flood, and anyone trying to reach it will be caught in high water." Aunt Mercy studied the girl's face in the dim light. "You hearing something in this storm that I'm not?" "I'm hearing the same thing my mama heard when she sang the storm songs. The weather's going to get worse before it gets better. And when it does, folks who know the safe roads are going to be the only ones who survive." Lightning split the sky, illuminating the cabin like daylight for one brilliant moment. In that flash, both woman and child saw the truth written in each other's eyes. This was not just rain, but the kind of storm that changes everything it touches. "Then we best get moving," Aunt Mercy said, reaching for her heavy cloak. "Can't let folks drown for want of warning." They slipped out into the storm just as another roll of thunder shook the ground beneath their feet. The rain hit their faces like cold needles, but Liddy moved through the darkness with sure steps, following paths only she could see. Behind them, lights still blazed in the big house, where men argued about debts and property and the price of souls. Ahead lay the chapel, and whatever hope could be kindled from the ashes of a dying world. The storm sang louder now, its voice rising to a howl that seemed to carry all the grief and rage of 100 generations. But underneath that wild music, Liddy's trained ear caught something else, a counterpoint melody that spoke not of destruction, but of cleansing, of washing away old sins to make room for new mercies. Thursday dawned grey and sodden. The storm had passed, leaving the countryside looking like a vast lake dotted with islands of higher ground. Roads that had been dusty wagon tracks were now rivers of mud. The river itself had jumped its banks, turning the low country into a maze of channels and standing water. At the chapel, Preacher Josiah surveyed the damage with weary eyes. Water had come within inches of the sanctuary floor, but the building still stood solid. Mrs. Tally arrived just after sunrise, her wagon loaded with supplies, and her face grim with purpose. "My store's flooded," she announced. "Lost most of my dry goods and half my medicines. But I saved the important things, the letters, the maps, the lists of safe houses that folks depend on." "Anyone hurt in the storm?" Josiah asked. "Not so far. But there's wagons stuck all over the county, and the ferry's been washed downstream. Folks trying to travel are going to be trapped for days." Elias arrived on horseback, his clothes soaked and his face tight with worry. "They came looking for Liddy last night. Griggs and 5 other men, all armed. Rook told them she was property that needed securing before the hearing." "Where is she now?" Mrs. Tally asked. "Safe with Aunt Mercy. But they'll keep looking." He dismounted and tied his horse to the chapel rail. "The hearing's still set for tomorrow, storm or no storm. Judge Whitmore's already in town. What about the debt papers Rook claimed to have? That's the strange part. Griggs says they were lost in the storm, wagon got stuck, papers got soaked beyond reading. Very convenient. Preacher Josiah stroked his beard thoughtfully. Sounds like the Lord might be taking a hand in this business. Maybe so, but we still need witnesses for the manumission hearing. And we need to keep Liddy alive long enough to give her testimony. Mrs. Tally climbed down from her wagon and began unloading bundles wrapped in oiled cloth. I brought everything I could save from the store, including some items that might interest you. She unwrapped a leather portfolio and drew out several sheets of official-looking paper. Correspondence between Mary Delacroix and various parties concerning the welfare of her daughter, including a letter to me dated just weeks before her death. Elias took the letter and read it by the grey morning light. Mary's handwriting was careful and clear, even as she lay dying. She wrote of her fears for Liddy's future, her hopes that the manumission papers would be honoured, and her trust that good people would step forward when the time came. She knew, he said wonderingly, she knew this day would come. Mary Delacroix was a wise woman, Mrs. Tally said. She also knew that papers can be forged, witnesses can be bought, and judges can be pressured. That's why she taught her daughter the songs. What do you mean? The songs aren't just directions, Mr. Boone. They're a test of character. Only someone with pure motives can hear them truly. A greedy man or a cruel one will miss the real meaning and get lost following false trails. Liddy appeared at the edge of the chapel yard, moving carefully through the mud with Aunt Mercy beside her. She wore a clean dress and had her hair braided with the blue ribbon, but her face was pale and serious. Heard horses on the road again this morning, she said. They're still looking. Dr. Cates emerged from the chapel, where he'd been tending a field hand injured in the storm. Child's been a blessing through all this, he said. Helped me set a broken arm and treated 2 cases of fever. Got healing hands to go with that sharp mind. Will you testify to that tomorrow? Elias asked. Gladly. Anyone with eyes can see this girl's got gifts that shouldn't be wasted on field labor. Liddy walked to the center of the group and looked at each face in turn. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. I've been thinking about tomorrow, she said, about what might happen if the judge rules against us. And I want everyone to know I'm not afraid. My mama taught me that freedom's not something someone else can give you or take away. It's something that lives in your heart. That's brave talk, child, Preacher Josiah said gently. But tomorrow's hearing will determine whether you stay here with folks who care about you or get sold to strangers who see you as property. I know. That's why I need to tell you something important. She fingered her locket and took a deep breath. The songs my mama taught me, they're not just about finding safe roads. They're about recognizing safe people. And every person standing here right now sings true. Mrs. Tally wiped her eyes with her handkerchief. What does that mean, little one? It means when I sing tomorrow, the whole truth will come out. Not just about the forged papers and the fake debts, but about who's trying to help and who's trying to hurt. The songs will know, and they'll make sure everyone else knows too. Thunder rumbled in the distance, not from new storms, but from the echo of yesterday's rain still draining toward the sea. In that deep, rolling sound, they all heard something that might have been promise or might have been warning. Tomorrow would bring answers. The only question was whether those answers would lead to freedom or to chains. Friday morning arrived with mist rising from the flooded fields like the breath of sleeping giants. The courthouse square stood on high ground, but the roads leading to it were ribboned with standing water. Wagons and riders picked their way carefully through the maze of mud and debris left by the storm. Judge Whitmore had arrived from the circuit court with his clerk and a wagon full of legal books. He was a stern man with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. Word had spread through the county about the unusual, hearing a manumission case complicated by debt claims and questions of forgery. By 9 o'clock, the courthouse steps were crowded with spectators. Plantation owners and their wives clustered under parasols, whispering about debts and property rights. Field hands and free blacks gathered in the shadows, hope and fear written equally on their faces. Doctor. Kate stood with Preacher Josiah and Mrs. Tally, their testimony ready for when it would be needed. Elias waited near the courthouse doors with his mother's Bible under his arm and his heart hammering against his ribs. Somewhere in the crowd, Rook and Griggs watched him with predator eyes. The forged debt papers might have been conveniently lost in the storm, but they would find other ways to challenge his mother's will. At precisely 10 o'clock, Liddy appeared at the edge of the square. She walked slowly but steadily, her blue ribbon bright in the grey morning light. Aunt Mercy walked beside her, one protective hand on the child's shoulder. As they approached the courthouse steps, conversations died away. Every eye turned toward the small girl who held so many destinies in her memory. Judge Whitmore took his place at a table on the courthouse steps, his law books and papers arranged in neat stacks. Clerk Haviland sat beside him with pen and ink, ready to record the proceedings. The judge's voice carried clearly across the square. Court is now in session for the matter of manumission papers submitted in the estate of Margaret Boone, deceased. Will the petitioner step forward? Elias climbed the steps and placed his mother's Bible on the judge's table. Your Honor, I submit these manumission papers, discovered in the binding of my mother's Bible and bearing the authentic seal of Clerk Haviland. The judge examined the stitched page through a magnifying glass, comparing the seal to samples in his record books. The seal appears genuine. Mr. Haviland, do you recall this transaction? Yes, Your Honor. Mrs. Boone came to my office 8 years ago. She was very particular about the wording and insisted the papers be sealed with the official stamp. Very well. Are there any objections to recording these manumissions? Rook stepped forward, his leather ledger clutched in both hands. Yes, Your Honor. I object on grounds that the estate carries substantial debts. Property listed in these papers has been pledged as collateral for loans that remain unpaid. Where are the loan documents? Rook's face darkened. Lost in yesterday's storm, Your Honor. The wagon carrying them got stuck in high water. A murmur ran through the crowd. Judge Whitmore's eyebrows rose slightly. How convenient. Do you have any other evidence of these alleged debts? I have my ledger showing the accounting. Ledger entries without supporting documents carry little weight in this court. Anyone with a pencil can write numbers in a book. The judge looked around the square. Are there witnesses to the deceased's intent regarding these manumissions? Dr. Cates stepped forward. Your Honor, I can testify to the character and intelligence of the child in question. She has assisted in my practice and shown remarkable skill in reading Latin prescriptions and calculating proper dosages. She saved a man's life just this week by correcting my error. That speaks to her abilities, Doctor, but not to the legal validity of these papers. Preacher, Josiah joined Dr. Cates on the steps. Your Honor, I knew Margaret Boone well. She spoke often of her desire to see certain souls freed after her death. She considered it a matter of Christian duty. Again, that addresses intent but not legal execution. Judge Whitmore shuffled through his papers. Are there any other witnesses? Mrs. Talley climbed the steps with her plain grey dress rustling and her face grave with purpose. Your Honor, I have correspondence from Margaret Boone discussing these very manumissions. She handed over the letters she had saved from the flood. Dated just weeks before her death and witnessed by my own hand. The judge read the letters carefully. When he looked up, his expression had shifted toward something that might have been sympathy. These letters clearly state Mrs. Boone's intent. Combined with the authenticated papers, they make a compelling case. He looked at Rook. Do you have any evidence besides your ledger to support your debt claims? From the back of the crowd came a new voice. He does not, Your Honor, because no such debts exist. Griggs pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with anger and his clothes still muddy from the storm. He carried a leather satchel that dripped water with every step. I am the alleged creditor, he announced, and I'm here to state for the record that Rook fabricated those debt claims without my knowledge or consent. A gasp ran through the crowd. Rook's face went white as chalk. That's not true. You agreed to... I agreed to nothing, Griggs cut him off. You approached me with a scheme to forge debt papers and split the proceeds from a private sale. I refused your offer and reported your proposal to the authorities. Judge Whitmore leaned forward in his chair. Mr. Griggs, are you saying the overseer attempted to involve you in fraud? Yes, Your Honor, and when I refused, he threatened to implicate me in other illegal activities unless I cooperated. Elias felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Griggs, the night patroller who had tried to use forged passes, was now testifying against Rook. Something was happening here that he didn't fully understand. The judge studied Griggs with careful eyes. This is a serious accusation. What proof do you offer? Griggs reached into his satchel and pulled out a soggy bundle of papers. These are the genuine documents Rook wanted me to forge. I kept them as evidence in case I needed to defend myself later." He handed the papers to the judge, who examined them through his magnifying glass. After a few minutes, Judge Whitmore looked up with his face grave. "These appear to be draft loan agreements with forged signatures. Mr. Rook, do you care to explain this?" Rook's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. His ledger slipped from his hands and hit the courthouse steps with a heavy thud. The debts were real. The estate owes money to whom?" the judge demanded. "These papers show no legitimate creditors, only forged signatures and fabricated amounts." The crowd began to murmur more loudly. Some of the plantation owners looked shocked. Others nodded as if pieces of a puzzle were finally falling into place. Judge Whitmore banged his gavel for order. "Mr. Rook, you are hereby charged with attempted fraud and forgery. You will be held for further investigation." He looked around the square. "Are there any other objections to recording these manumissions?" No one spoke. Even the whispers had died away. "Very well, Mr. Haviland. You will record these manumissions as legal and binding. The individuals named in these papers are hereby declared free." But as the clerk reached for his pen, a new commotion arose at the edge of the square. A group of men on horseback were pushing through the crowd, their leader wearing a badge that caught the morning light. "Hold there, Judge," the leader called out. "I'm Sheriff Patterson from the next county. Got warrants here, need serving before any papers get signed." Judge Whitmore frowned. "What warrants?" "For that girl there," Patterson pointed at. "Liddy. She's wanted for questioning in connection with illegal activities, harboring fugitive slaves, conspiracy to aid escape, and teaching forbidden knowledge." A chill ran down Elias's spine. Even with Rook exposed and the debt claims proven false, they were still trying to find a way to take Liddy. "What evidence supports these charges?" Judge Whitmore asked. "She's been heard singing coded songs that map escape routes. That's a crime in this state, Your Honor. Teaching slaves the roads to freedom." All eyes turned to Liddy, who stood small and straight beside Aunt Mercy. The crowd waited to see what the child would do when faced with this new threat. She looked up at Judge Whitmore with clear, unafraid eyes. "Your Honor," she said in her sweet, strong voice, "may I be allowed to sing? I believe the truth will speak for itself." The courthouse square fell silent as death. Even the wind in the oak trees seemed to hold its breath. Judge Whitmore studied the small girl who stood before him with such calm courage. "Child," he said gently, "you understand the seriousness of these charges. Teaching escape routes to slaves is indeed a crime in this state." "Yes, sir. But I never taught anyone anything except healing and hope." Liddy fingered her locket. "The songs my mama gave me aren't about running away. They're about finding your way home." Sheriff Patterson shifted restlessly in his saddle. "Your Honor, the girl's been heard singing coded directions. Multiple witnesses will testify to it." "What witnesses?" Judge Whitmore asked. "Well." Patterson looked around the square and his confident expression faltered slightly. "There's Rook here, and Mr. Rook is currently under arrest for fraud," the judge pointed out dryly. "His testimony carries little weight." "Who else?" Patterson's eyes moved through the crowd, searching for support. But the faces looking back at him were closed and wary. Even among the plantation owners, there seemed to be little appetite for persecuting a child who had just exposed a conspiracy against them all. "Your Honor," Liddy said quietly, "may I show you what the songs really mean?" Judge Whitmore nodded. "You may proceed, child, but be careful. Your words will be taken down as evidence." Liddy stepped forward until she stood directly in front of the judge's table. She looked out over the crowd at the hostile faces of some, the hopeful faces of others, and the uncertain faces of many who didn't know what to believe. Then she began to sing. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, rising and falling like water over stones. But the words were not what anyone expected. Instead of coded directions, she sang about a physician's prescription, how to measure willow bark for fever, how to mix chamomile for sleeplessness, how to calculate doses based on a patient's size and symptoms. "When the shallow belly burns, count the grains to 7, she sang. 3 drops shine in water clear, and the doses proven." Dr. Cates stepped forward with wonder in his eyes. "Your Honor, that's not an escape song at all. That's a medical formula, how to prepare fever medicine. Shallow belly means an empty stomach. Count the grains to 7 refers to measuring willow bark. 3 drops in water is the proper dilution. Liddy nodded and began another verse. This one sounded like directions to river crossings, but Dr. Cates translated again. That's surgical instruction, he said excitedly. How to clean wounds and apply bandages. 3 lights means examining the injury in good illumination. Brown door refers to the color of healing flesh. A murmur of amazement ran through the crowd. Liddy continued singing, verse after verse of what sounded like escape routes, but were actually medical knowledge disguised as lullabies. Your Honor, Dr. Cates said when she paused, this child's mother was a healer. She encoded medical knowledge in songs to help her people treat illness and injury. These aren't escape routes, they're prescriptions and surgical procedures passed down through generations. Judge Whitmore leaned forward with fascination. Are you certain, Doctor? Absolutely. I've seen her use these songs to calculate proper doses and treat patients. She saved a man's life just this week using knowledge from one of these coded melodies. Sheriff Patterson's face had gone red with frustration. That's not what I was told. My informant said she was teaching escape routes. Your informants were wrong, Mrs. Talley said firmly. I've heard Mary Delacroix sing these same songs while treating sick children in my store. They're healing songs, not escape songs. Preacher Josiah nodded agreement. I've seen the child use these melodies to calm frightened patients and help them remember medical instructions. There's nothing illegal about teaching medicine, but Liddy held up one small hand for silence. There is one more song, she said quietly, the most important one. May I sing it, Your Honor? Judge Whitmore nodded, though his eyes were wary. Liddy's voice rose in a melody more beautiful than any they'd heard yet. But these words were different, not about medicine or healing, but about something deeper. When the heart grows heavy with sorrow and pain, count the blessings through sunshine and rain. 3 lights shine in the darkest hour, and love becomes freedom's truest power. As she sang, her small hand went to her locket and opened it. The tiny portrait inside caught the morning light, a woman's face full of love and wisdom. This song isn't about healing bodies, Liddy said when the melody ended. It's about healing hearts, about finding freedom inside yourself, even when the world tries to chain you. My mama taught it to me, so I'd never forget that I'm more than what other people say I am. Tears were running down several faces in the crowd. Even Judge Whitmore had to clear his throat before he could speak. Sheriff Patterson, he said finally, I see no evidence of criminal activity here. This child has demonstrated remarkable knowledge of medicine and healing. If that's what you call forbidden knowledge, then we should be encouraging it, not prosecuting it. But, Your Honor, the matter is closed. These charges are dismissed for lack of evidence. The judge turned to Clerk Haviland. You may proceed with recording the manumissions. But even as Haviland reached for his pen, the sound of galloping horses came from the edge of the square. Through the crowd rode a group of armed men led by a figure who made Elias's blood run cold. The real Griggs, his face twisted with rage and his hand on the butt of his pistol. Stop this proceeding, he shouted. That man there is an impostor. All eyes turned to the first Griggs, who had been standing quietly near the judge's table. His face had gone pale, but he didn't try to run. Your Honor, the newcomer called out, that man stole my name and my authority. He's been using forged credentials to pass himself off as a legitimate patroller. I'm the real Griggs, and I demand that girl be turned over to me immediately. The square erupted in confused voices. Judge Whitmore banged his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. Through the chaos, Liddy's clear voice cut like a blade. He's lying. Every sound died away. The small girl stood straight and unafraid, looking directly at the mounted man who claimed authority over her life. How do you know he's lying, child? Judge Whitmore asked. Liddy's hand went to her locket again. Because the songs know. They've been testing everyone since I started singing. And that man there, she pointed at the real Griggs, his heart sounds like a cracked bell, full of hate and greed and cruelty. But the other man, she looked at the impostor, he sounds true. Scared maybe, but true. The false Griggs stepped forward and pulled off his hat. Underneath was a younger face than anyone expected, marked by old scars and tired eyes. My name is Thomas Fletcher, he said quietly. I was a slave on the Dalton plantation until 5 years ago when I escaped north. I came back to help others find freedom, and I've been using stolen papers to move through the county safely." A gasp ran through the crowd. A runaway slave, standing free in the courthouse square and admitting his identity. "I knew this hearing was my chance to do something good," Fletcher continued, "to help expose the fraud and maybe save one child from the fate I ran from. So, I took the real Griggs's name and played his role. But I never intended to deceive the court about anything that mattered." Judge Whitmore looked from Fletcher to the mounted Griggs, then back to Liddy. "Child, how do your songs tell you who to trust?" "They listen to hearts, Your Honor. Some hearts sing clean and true, even when they're scared. Others sound muddy and false, even when they're telling facts." She looked around. The square. "Every person who's spoken for me today has a true heart. But that man up there," she pointed at the real Griggs, "his heart is full of poison." The real Griggs snarled and reached for his pistol. "Enough of this nonsense. I'm a legally appointed—" "You're a fraud yourself," Fletcher interrupted. "I've got papers here that prove your credentials are as false as the passes you've been selling to desperate people." He pulled out a bundle of documents and threw them at the judge's feet. "Real patrollers don't charge fees to look the other way. Real patrollers don't sell forged papers to the highest bidder. This man's been running a criminal enterprise for years." Judge Whitmore gathered up the papers and began to read. His face grew darker with each page. "These documents suggest a pattern of corruption and fraud spanning several counties," he said finally. "Mr. Griggs, or whoever you are, you're hereby relieved of any authority in this jurisdiction. You can't—" "I can and I do. Furthermore, you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and abuse of office." The judge looked at his bailiff. "Take him into custody." But Griggs wasn't finished. As the bailiff approached, he spurred his horse forward and leaned down toward Liddy. "If I can't have you legal, I'll take you anyway," he snarled, reaching out to grab her. That was when Liddy did something that froze every heart in the square. She began to sing again, not the healing songs this time, but something wild and urgent that seemed to call the very storm back out of the sky. Her voice rose like wind in the trees, and the horses began to dance nervously. Dogs throughout the square started howling. Even the courthouse bell began to sway on its rope. And in that eerie music, every person present heard their own heart laid bare, their fears, their hopes, their deepest truths exposed for all to see. Griggs's horse reared up in terror, pawing at the air. The man himself cried out as if in pain, his hands pressed to his ears. "Make her stop," he screamed. "Make it stop." But Liddy's song went on, drawing truth from the very stones of the courthouse square. In its terrible clarity, every lie was exposed, every deception revealed, every false heart made known. When the song finally ended, Griggs lay unconscious beside his fallen horse. The square was silent, except for the sound of weeping, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming relief of truth finally told. Judge Whitmore wiped his eyes and looked at the child who had just changed everything. "Liddy Delacroix," he said in a voice that carried across the square, "by the power invested in me by this court, and in recognition of your mother's final wishes, I declare you free. Mr. Haviland, record it so." The clerk's pen scratched across the official paper, red wax dropped onto parchment, and the judge's seal pressed down with finality. As the crowd began to cheer, Elias stepped forward and offered Liddy his hand. She took it with her small fingers, and together they walked down the courthouse steps into a world that had just become a little more free. Behind them, Aunt Mercy wiped her eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Mary. Your girl done good." Evening came soft and golden to the country chapel, painting the white walls amber and sending long shadows across the cemetery grass. Inside, candles flickered along the altar rail, while Preacher Josiah prepared for a different kind of service than he'd ever conducted before. At the pine table that served as his desk, official papers lay ready for signing, freedom papers with Judge Whitmore's seal still warm in the wax, employment contracts for those who chose to stay and work for wages, letters of passage for those who wished to seek family elsewhere. Liddy sat in the front pew, her locket open in her palm. The tiny portrait of her mother seemed to smile in the candlelight. Beside her, Aunt Mercy hummed softly while she mended a tear in her shawl. "Doctor," Cates had come from town with his medical bag and a bottle of celebratory cider. Mrs. Tally arranged wildflowers at the altar with quiet satisfaction. Elias stood near the door, greeting each person who arrived for what folks were already calling The signing. Field hands who had worked the plantation for generations. House servants who had kept the big house running. Children who had grown up in the quarters and never dared dream of anything beyond. All free now. All choosing their own paths. "This feels like Christmas and Easter rolled into one," Aunt Mercy said, her needle flashing in the lamplight. "Never thought I'd live to see such a day." Liddy closed her locket with a soft click. "Mama always said freedom was like sunrise. You can't make it come faster, but when it arrives, it lights up everything." From outside came the sound of wagon wheels on gravel. Through the window, they saw Thomas Fletcher climbing down from the driver's seat. He'd shed his false identity as smoothly as taking off an ill-fitting coat, but Judge Whitmore had granted him sanctuary in exchange for his testimony about the corruption he'd witnessed. Fletcher entered the chapel and removed his hat respectfully. "Evening, folks. Brought supplies from Mrs. Tally's store, new stock she managed to save from the flood." He carried in baskets of thread and needles, bolts of cloth, and a precious cargo of books and writing supplies. The beginnings of a proper school, Elias realized. Education for children who had never been allowed to learn their letters. "There's something else," Fletcher said quietly. "Got word from up north. Folks there are asking about the girl who sang the truth in the courthouse square. Words spreading about what happened here." Liddy looked up from her mother's locket. "What kind of word?" "Good word. About courage and wisdom and songs that heal instead of harm. About a little girl who proved that freedom lives in the heart before it lives anywhere else." Dr. Cates poured cider into tin cups and passed them around. "Here's to new beginnings," he said, raising his cup, "and to old promises kept." They drank as the sun set behind the oak trees, painting the chapel windows with colors like spilled honey and crushed roses. Outside, the last of the floodwater was draining away, leaving the land clean and ready for planting. One by one, people came forward to sign their names or make their marks if they couldn't write yet on the papers that made their freedom official. Each signature was witnessed by candlelight, each name spoken aloud like a prayer of thanksgiving. When it came Liddy's turn, she took the quill pen in her small hand and wrote her name in letters as clear and straight as her mother had taught her. Liddy Delacroix. Free. Preacher Josiah blotted the ink carefully and looked at the signature with satisfaction. "That's a name that'll be remembered, child, in this chapel and beyond." As full dark settled over the countryside, the signing was complete. Some folks prepared to leave immediately to search for family sold away years before, or to join relatives in free states where their children could grow up without fear. Others chose to stay and help build something new from the ashes of the old plantation system. Mrs. Tally had offered her store as a stopping point for those traveling north. Dr. Cates planned to train several people in basic medicine to serve communities that had never had proper doctoring. Preacher Josiah would expand his chapel to include a schoolroom where children could learn to read the Bible and everything else they could lay their hands on. "What about you, little one?" Aunt Mercy asked Liddy. "What will you do with your freedom?" Liddy stood at the chapel window, looking out at the stars beginning to appear in the clear night sky. "I want to learn everything," she said simply. "How to read every book ever written, how to heal people like my mama did, how to sing new songs that carry hope instead of sorrow. And where will you do all this learning?" She turned from the window with a smile that lit up the chapel like another candle. "Right here. This is home. These are my people. Why would I want to be anywhere else?" Elias felt something warm and grateful settle in his chest. For weeks he'd feared losing the child whose smile had become the bright spot in his days. Now he realized that friendship, like freedom, wasn't something you could own or lose. It was something that grew stronger when given freely. "Then we'll build the finest school this county's ever seen," he promised. "With books and slates and everything a bright mind needs to flourish." Fletcher stood near the altar, turning his hat in his hands. "If you'll have me, I'd like to stay too. Help with the teaching. Got some reading and figuring myself, and I know things about the wider world that might be useful." "You'll be welcome," Preacher Josiah said. "We'll need all the help we can get to build something worthy of the sacrifices that brought us here." As the evening drew toward its close, Liddy asked if she might sing one more song. Not the coded healing songs this time, or the truth-telling melody that had exposed so many lies, but something new, something born from the day's joy and hope. Her voice rose sweet and clear in the candlelit chapel, weaving a melody that spoke of morning after long night, of rivers running free to the sea, of children growing up unafraid. The words were simple but profound, carrying the weight of dreams finally allowed to take wing. When the song ended, no one spoke for a long moment. The silence was full of peace, the kind of peace that comes after justice has been served and mercy has had its way. Finally, folks began to gather their things and prepare for the journey home. Some would sleep in the chapel that night before beginning longer journeys. Others would return to familiar cabins that now felt different because they were chosen rather than assigned. Elias walked Liddy and Aunt Mercy to the old plantation wagon for the ride back to the quarters, which weren't quarters anymore, but simply home for people who chose to stay. The night air was soft and warm, carrying the scent of honeysuckle and the distant sound of the river running free. "Thank you," Liddy said as they climbed into the wagon, "for believing in me, for standing up when it mattered, for being brave enough to do the right thing even when it was hard." "Thank you," Elias replied, "for teaching me what courage looks like, for showing me that the smallest person can change everything if their heart is true." As the wagon rolled down the moonlit road, Liddy hummed softly not one of her mother's coded songs, but the new melody she'd created in the chapel. Behind them, warm light spilled from the chapel windows like a beacon in the darkness. Ahead lay home and rest, and tomorrow's possibilities. At the edge of the old quarters, Elias helped them down from the wagon. The little houses looked the same in the moonlight, but everything had changed. No overseer stalked these paths now. No ledger recorded human souls as property. No children would be measured against doorframes and counted like livestock. "I'll see you tomorrow," Liddy said, her hand touching the locket at her throat. "Same time, same place by the fence." Elias smiled. "Wouldn't miss it for the world." She disappeared into Aunt Mercy's cabin, but her humming continued for a few moments longer, the new song drifting through the thin walls like a blessing on the night air. Elias stood listening until the sound faded away. Then he climbed back onto the wagon and drove toward the big house, which would also be different now. Not a symbol of power over others, but simply a home where a man could live with a clear conscience. 6 months later, dawn came pink and gold over the chapel school, painting the new addition that housed a dozen desks and a shelf of precious books. In the doorway, Liddy stood with a slate in one hand and a piece of chalk in the other, helping younger children practice their letters. Her hair was longer now, braided with a bright yellow ribbon. The silver locket still hung at her throat, but she wore it differently, not as a secret burden, but as a proud connection to the mother who had given her so much more than freedom papers hidden in a Bible. "Remember," she told little Samuel as he struggled with the letter B, "each letter has its own song. Listen to how it wants to sound, and your hand will know how to write it." Through the window came the sound of hammering from the workshop, where Thomas Fletcher taught carpentry to older boys. "Doctor," Kate's voice drifted from the medical classroom next door, where several young people learned to compound medicines and treat common ailments. "Mrs. Tally's general store had reopened, with a reading room where anyone could sit and practice their letters. The sound of wagon wheels on the chapel road announced the morning's first visitor. Elias climbed down from the driver's seat, a bundle of newspapers under his arm and a smile on his face. "Morning, scholars," he called out. "Brought the latest papers from Charleston. Got some interesting news about a certain young lady whose story's been traveling." Liddy set down her slate and walked to the wagon. "What kind of news?" Elias unfolded one of the newspapers and showed her a column on the second page. There, in careful print, was an account of the courthouse hearing and its aftermath. But it wasn't written as news, it was written as hope. "The truth singer of Millbrook County," Liddy read aloud. "A child whose courage exposed corruption and whose wisdom pointed the way toward justice." "Read the rest," Elias encouraged. Liddy's voice grew stronger as she continued reading. The article told of similar cases in other counties, overseers caught in fraudulent schemes, forged papers exposed, manumission documents honored after years of illegal suppression. Judge Whitmore had used their case as precedent to investigate corruption throughout his circuit. "It says here that 3 other plantations have established schools for freed children," Liddy said wonderingly, "and 2 more counties have appointed new clerks to review old manumission papers that might have been suppressed. Your song started something." "Child," Fletcher said, coming out of the workshop with sawdust in his hair. Truth has a way of spreading when someone's brave enough to sing it first. Doctor. Cates emerged from the medical classroom, wiping his hands on a clean cloth. Got a letter yesterday from a colleague in Richmond. Says there's talk of establishing a whole network of schools like this one. Places where children can learn healing and reading and everything else they need to build better lives. All because one little girl refused to be silent, Mrs. Tally added, walking up from her store with a basket of fresh baked bread. Sometimes the smallest voice carries the farthest. Liddy folded the newspaper carefully and tucked it into her apron pocket. It's not just my voice, she said. It's all of us together. That's what makes the harmony strong enough to carry. The chapel bell began to ring, calling students to their morning lessons. Children emerged from houses throughout the settlement, some former slaves, some poor whites, all eager to learn whatever the day's classes would offer. As they filed into the schoolroom, Liddy took her place at the front, with a reader in one hand and a song in her heart. The lessons began as they always did, with a simple melody that helped young minds remember their letters and numbers. Through the window, the morning sun painted everything gold. The faces of children bent over their slates, the hands of craftsmen shaping wood into useful things, the garden where healing herbs grew beside vegetables for the common table. It was a scene that would have been unimaginable just months before, but here it was, real as sunlight and solid as the oak trees that sheltered the chapel. At midday, when lessons paused for dinner, Liddy walked to the old fence where Elias had once waited for her smile. It was still there, weathered and familiar, but now it divided nothing. Children played on both sides. Adults moved freely back and forth. It had become simply another line in the landscape, no more significant than a creek bank or a property boundary. Elias appeared beside her, carrying 2 cups of cool buttermilk and wearing the easy expression of a man whose conscience was at peace. "Still meeting at the fence," he said with a grin. "Some habits are worth keeping," Liddy replied, accepting her cup gratefully. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the children play and listening to the sound of industry from the workshop and medical rooms. The future was spreading out before them like a map drawn in hope instead of fear. "Sometimes I dream about her," Liddy said quietly. "My mama. She's standing in a field of flowers, and she's singing. Not the coded songs, just pure happiness, like water running over stones. What do you think she'd say if she could see all this?" Liddy touched her locket and smiled the same small, steady smile that had started everything, but brighter now, surrounded by the clear light of a world where children could dream of tomorrow. "I think she'd say the seeds she planted have grown into something beautiful, and that the best songs are the ones that teach other people to sing." Behind them, the chapel bell rang again, calling everyone back to their afternoon work. Students and teachers, craftsmen and healers, all moving with purpose toward the future they were building together. As they walked back toward the school, Liddy began to hum not one of her mother's coded melodies, but the new song she'd been composing, a song about freedom, earned, and justice. Served, about children learning to read and communities learning to heal. It was a song that carried no secrets, required no codes, and could be sung openly by anyone brave enough to believe that tomorrow could be better than yesterday. And in the golden afternoon light of the chapel schoolyard, surrounded by friends and students and the sound of honest work, Liddy Delacroix sang her heart into the world, one clear note at a time. The end.